Did you know that butchers used to wear high heels to work? Wait, did you think high heels were only ever for women? Oh, honey, if that's what you think, you need to stick around. High heels are a staple in a lot of women's wardrobes today. According to the Spine Health Institute, about 72% of women wear them. But why? Well, to understand that, we need to go all the way back to ancient Egypt, to one of the first known records of heels, and the start of a pattern where only men wore them, then only women wore them, then back to men, sometimes to both, until they finally became intrinsically associated with women's attractiveness and created with form over function. High heels were initially only for men, and throughout history indicated social status, were part of ceremonial garb, a sign of power, and one of the most painful inventions to ever exist. Around 4000 BCE, we find the first accepted record of shoes. They were flexible pieces of leather bound with leather ties. There's evidence of them at King Tut's tomb. He had elaborate sandals engraved with gold. In ancient Greece, high heels were for actors. It was a quick way to know a character's social status. The higher the heel, the higher the status. And by the way, only men were allowed to be actors. Quite often, however, Persia is credited for bringing high heels to the world. See, because back in the 16th century, high heels served a really good purpose there. Men wore them to ride horses, to stay on the horse. And it was nearly unheard of for a woman to wear them. When Shah Abbas, a Persian monarch, toured European courts in that same century, wearing, of course, elaborately decorated heels, the royals wanted a piece of that shit, but they went ahead and disregarded the pieces that were useful and functional and comfortable. Moving forward a bit, and one of the time periods when women wore heels. In Venice, women wore, quote, staggeringly high, slightly tilted heels. Some of them were as tall as 24 inches. They were called chopines, and they were meant to keep long skirts out of the mud, well, and to preserve their real shoes, which were far more delicate, usually animal skin or satin, and far more comfortable than the heels. The pendulum swung back to men. But eventually, and frequently, heels were deemed feminine and worn to emphasize women's bodies so they could be more attractive to men. Well, until France outright banned them. Because in a pattern that also existed for centuries, heels had become synonymous with prostitution. Women wore them to draw attention and clientele. Heels had been considered a sign of power for men. For women, it was a surrender of power to those men. But before you go thinking that heels were specific to only the Western world, let's head over to Japan, to the geisha. While not necessarily heels, they did wear platforms. The soles were usually solid wooden blocks, so they would tower off the ground. Okay, but as I've mentioned, heels have always been polarizing, for being really tall or really small. For men or for women, depending. Or to indicate that a woman would take your money and make you feel good. Well, as you can imagine, royalty and the privileged have usually driven the trends. Like in 1533, when Catherine de' Medici caused quite the stir at her wedding. She wore shoes with a low sole and high heel, definitely more decorative than functional, because she wanted to look more adult-like. She was only 14 after all. For much of history, whether you like it or not, heels were intended for men. And it wasn't just for horseback riding or social status. They also fed men's vanity, so they could feel at least as tall as the other men in the room. You want an example, right? King Louis XIV of France. That dude stood a whopping 5'4" and was not happy about it. So when he found out about heels, he jumped at that shit. He became known for trademark red heels, painted in his personal shade. And he never went anywhere without them. You can see in portraits of him that I am not full of shit. Alas, all good things must come to an end. Because the French Revolution. And they ended society's love affair with heels for quite a while. Because heels were associated with the royals. And the folks who had overthrown them wanted nothing to do with their shoes. When the Puritans brought them over to what became the United States, well, it didn't take too long before the pious banned them. Because again, heels were for harlots. Oh, and witches. There's literally nothing from that time period that would exclude you indefinitely from that kind of an accusation. Then the Victorians brought them back in a big way in the mid-19th century, around the same time that photography was making its mark. And of course that meant send nudes. No, seriously, you get a camera, you do some erotic photography, and you put them in heels. It was about that time when men decided to permanently distance themselves from heels. Because they could only be for women, they were a sign of impracticality and irrationality. Convenient that men forgot that heels were originally their dominion. Right before they decided that heels were another great way to control women and their bodies. Oh, and their decisions. As such, and more, heels were for appearance, not long walks in the park. Moving forward to more modern times and the advent of stiletto heels. They first appeared in the 1930s, and there's a lot of disagreement about who actually invented them. The major consensus credits them to Roger Vivier in his work with Christian Dior, and in the 1950s, Marilyn Monroe. She made them very popular. Sources said she would shave about a quarter inch off of one of her heels so that she would, quote, walk with a wiggle. Form over function, remember, folks? And that hasn't necessarily improved over time. Oh, right, but I forgot about the butchers. So if you didn't know, butchers are people who handle the slaughter of animals for food. And that is not necessarily a neat process. There's blood, guts, other grossness, and all of that is really bad for shoes. So in ancient and more recent time, butchers took to wearing heels. They could stay above the bloody floors and step over carcasses. Those were function over form. But we went ahead and fucked that up, didn't we? What began as a status symbol and common sense piece of footwear has since become a nearly $40 billion industry, with a lot less comfort and practicality. You may have seen those shoes with the iconic red sole. Yeah, they're the signature of Louboutin, a French designer. But he's kind of a dick, and I'm going to quote him to prove it. In an interview, he said, "I hate the whole concept of comfort. It's like when people say, well, we're not really in love, but we are in a comfortable relationship. You're abandoning a lot of ideas when you are too into comfort. Comfy? That's one of the worst words." In other words, beauty is pain. But there is more affected than appearances. In a 2013 survey, 1 in 3 women admitted to walking home barefoot because of the throbbing the heels caused. A separate study that same year showed that the average woman wearing stiletto heels was in severe pain by 1 hour, 6 minutes. Woo, yeah, form over function. And women proliferate the bullshit too. For example, a woman called Lisa Small, the curator of exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum, once said, "You could just as easily ask men why they wear ties, which aren't particularly comfortable." Now let me ask you, is that really a reasonable comparison? Fuck to the no, it isn't. Dudes wearing ties don't feel like they're going to explode from the pressure of a piece of cloth. They can literally just loosen it up a bit and keep it on, and appearances are upheld. Men can take off their ties completely on their way home from work, immediately escaping the discomfort. Nobody thinks twice. Pain from high heels takes much longer to dissipate. And it's not just discomfort. It's fucking dangerous. According to a study performed at Samyo University in Korea on lumbar and cervical activation, that's your spine, kids, and you kind of need it. The higher the heel, the bigger the risk. Increased muscle fatigue over time, possible complications like swelling and decreased movement, and detrimental effects to your posture. And let's not forget, heels can cause permanent damage to your feet. But sure, they're the same as ties. Fuck's sake. Today, there are many more options for functional shoes, comfortable and sensible. But women continue to feel pressure to wear them if they're going out. Gotta appeal to the male gaze, ladies. Using that previous example, the comparison, just like a man's tie in his wardrobe, heels are an expected part of a woman's wardrobe, one that can literally destroy their feet. And that asshole who said comfort is the worst thing ever, yeah, of course he did. Because regardless of how much they hurt, women keep buying them. According to the Louboutin website, they sell shoes for between $745 and fucking $2,400 a pair. He's laughing all the way to the bank. He literally became a billionaire in 2023. By comparison, Nike sell for between $85 and $550, depending how deep your pockets are. The most expensive pair of Nikes, though, sold for a little over $2 million. And they weren't even new. They were worn in the 1998 NBA Finals, a pair of Air Jordans. While heels did serve a useful purpose, in many instances and centuries, that's largely not true today. Because the world keeps reminding us, beauty is pain, and we just keep on paying for it and begging for more.